July 1 Sty, 1916. 7:30 in the morning. Across a 20-mile stretch of French countryside, British soldiers climb wooden ladders. They step over sandbags and into open ground. And then they walk. Not run, walk. Directly toward German machine guns that can fire 600 rounds per minute. Within seconds, men begin to fall. Within minutes, thousands are dead or dying. By the end of that single day, nearly 20,000 British soldiers will be killed. Another 40,000 wounded or missing. The bloodiest day in British military history. And it all began with a simple order: walk forward, don't run, maintain formation, advance slowly across no man's land. This is the story of the day soldiers were ordered to walk into machine guns. The day obedience became a death sentence. The day generals made a decision that would haunt history forever. To understand this moment, you have to go back. Back to a world that believed war was still something noble, something glorious. Back to 1914, when men lined up to enlist, afraid the fighting would be over before they got their chance at glory. Back to a time when military commanders were trained in cavalry charges and battlefield honor, when wars were won by discipline and courage, when soldiers advanced in neat lines with flags flying and drums beating. But World War I wasn't that kind of war. It was a war of steel and smoke and mud. A war where technology had outpaced tactics by decades. Machine guns had been invented. Artillery shells could obliterate entire landscapes. Barbed wire stretched for miles. Trenches scarred the earth from the English Channel to the Swiss border. And in between those trenches lay no man's land, a wasteland of shell craters and corpses and mud so thick it could swallow a man whole. The generals didn't understand this new reality. Or maybe they did, but couldn't accept it. They were men from another era, trained in another kind of warfare. They believed in discipline above all else. They believed soldiers who maintained formation and followed orders would always defeat soldiers who broke ranks and scattered. They believed courage and morale could overcome steel and fire. So when they planned a battle of the Somme, they planned it like a traditional battle. They would bombard the German lines for 7 days straight. 2 million shells. They were certain nothing could survive that kind of bombardment. The German trenches would be destroyed. The barbed wire would be cut. The machine gun positions would be obliterated. All the British soldiers would have to do was walk across no man's land and occupy the ruins. Walk, not run. That was crucial to the plan. If soldiers ran, they would arrive at the German lines exhausted and disorganized. They would bunch up. They would lose formation, and formation was everything. Each man carried 60 pounds of equipment. Wire cutters, extra ammunition, shovels, rations, sandbags. They were loaded down like pack mules. Running would be difficult. Maintaining any kind of order while running would be impossible. So the order went out: advance at a steady walking pace. Stay in formation. Keep your spacing. Officers would lead with walking sticks and cigarettes, showing contempt for enemy fire to inspire their men. Sergeants would maintain the line. And the soldiers, these citizen soldiers who had been factory workers and farmers and shopkeepers just months before, would do as they were told. Because that's what soldiers do. They obey. The night before the attack, the British trenches were packed with men, shoulder to shoulder. Too many bodies in too small a space. Some wrote letters home. Some cleaned their rifles for the 100th time. Some prayed. Many couldn't sleep. The bombardment had been going on for days, a constant thunder that shook the earth and rattled teeth and made conversation impossible. But now, in these final hours, some of them wondered. Some of them questioned. They had been in the trenches long enough to know what machine guns could do. They had seen the German positions through periscopes. They had watched previous attacks fail. They knew the wire wasn't all cut. They knew some of the German bunkers were 40 feet deep, carved into chalk, reinforced with concrete and steel. They knew those men would survive the bombardment. But orders were orders, and British soldiers didn't question orders. That was the culture. That was the training. From the moment they enlisted, it had been drilled into them: obey without hesitation. Trust your officers. Trust the plan. Your job isn't to think. Your job is to do. There was also shame. Powerful, crushing shame. The thought of refusing, of holding back, of showing fear in front of your mates was worse than death. These men came from villages and towns where everyone knew everyone. They had enlisted together, trained together, fought together. They were pals' battalions, friends and brothers and neighbors. If you didn't go over the top when the whistle blew, you were a coward. And being called a coward was a fate worse than any bullet. The military reinforced this with ruthless efficiency. Men who refused orders in combat were shot, court-martialed and executed by firing squad. Pour encourager les autres, as the French said, to encourage the others. Fear of your own officers could be as strong as fear of the enemy. So as dawn broke on July 1 Est, 1916, the men prepared. They checked their equipment. They fixed bayonets. They waited for the whistles. And they tried not to think about what was coming. At 7:28 in the morning, the bombardment stopped. After 7 days of constant shelling, the sudden silence was deafening. Across no man's land, in the German trenches, men who had been huddled in deep bunkers for a week began to emerge. They hauled their machine guns up ladder after ladder. They set up positions. They loaded ammunition belts. They looked out across no man's land and waited. They didn't have to wait long. At 7:30, whistles blew. All along the British line, officers climbed ladders. They stepped onto the parapet. They turned to face their men and shouted, "Follow me!" And the men followed. They climbed up and over. They formed lines in no man's land, and they began to walk, slowly, steadily, just as they had been ordered, just as they had practiced dozens of times behind the lines. Lines of men walking forward across open ground under a summer sky. The German machine gunners couldn't believe what they were seeing. Target practice, as what some of them called it later. Rows of men walking slowly toward them, not taking cover, not running, not zigzagging. Just walking in formation as if they were on parade. The machine guns opened fire. The sound was like ripping cloth, amplified 1,000 times. A stuttering roar that rolled across the battlefield. And the British soldiers began to fall, not one or two at a time, dozens. Hundreds. Men simply dropped where they stood, one moment walking, the next moment gone. Crumpled into the mud. Shot through the chest, through the head, through the legs and arms and spine. Some soldiers tried to keep walking. They stepped over their fallen comrades. They maintained formation because that's what they had been told to do. Others froze. Others ran forward. Others tried to crawl to shell holes for cover, but there was no cover. The bombardment that was supposed to destroy the German defenses had done almost nothing. The wire was still intact in most places. Men became tangled in it, hung up like scarecrows, cut down while they struggled to free themselves. The officers went down first. They were easy targets, standing upright, carrying pistols and swagger sticks instead of rifles. Within minutes, most units had lost their leaders. Sergeants tried to take command. They went down too. Men who had trained together for months suddenly found themselves leaderless, exposed under fire from multiple directions, unsure whether to advance or retreat, or simply dig themselves into the mud and pray. And still the machine guns fired. Belt after belt of ammunition. The barrels glowed red hot. Gunners poured water on them to keep them from warping. And they kept firing, because the targets kept coming. Wave after wave of British soldiers climbing out of their trenches, walking forward, falling, being replaced by more men who climbed over the bodies and kept walking. In some sectors, men did reach the German trenches. They fought, hand to hand in the narrow corridors of earth and sandbags. Bayonets and clubs and grenades. Close enough to see each other's faces. Close enough to hear each other scream. Small victories. Brief moments of success before German counterattacks drove them back or surrounded them or killed them all. In most sectors, the attack failed within the first hour. Men pinned down in no man's land, unable to advance, unable to retreat. Lying in shell holes as the sun climbed higher and the day grew hot. Wounded men crying for water. Dying men calling for their mothers. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones lay in the mud for hours, sometimes days, before death took them. By mid-morning, it was clear the attack had failed. Officers in headquarters, miles behind the lines, received confused and fragmentary reports. Some units had taken their objectives. Others had been wiped out. Communication trenches were clogged with wounded men streaming backward. Runners sent forward to assess the situation often never returned. The generals ordered renewed attacks. Different sectors, different timings, the same result. More men climbing out, more men walking forward, more men falling. 60,000 British casualties on the first day of the Somme. 20,000 dead. The worst single day of loss in British military history. And for what? A few hundred yards of ground in some places. Nothing in most places. The German lines held. The machine guns were still firing. No man's land was carpeted with bodies. The Battle of the Somme would continue for 4.5 more months. By the time it ended in November, over 1 million men had been killed or wounded. British, French, German. The front line had barely moved. A few miles here and there. Nothing strategically significant. Nothing worth the cost. But that first day became something more than a military disaster. It became a symbol of everything wrong with how World War I was fought. A symbol of the disconnect between generals and soldiers. A symbol of outdated tactics meeting modern weapons. A symbol of obedience taken to its most terrible extreme. The men who survived never forgot it. They never forgot the order to walk. They never forgot watching their friends die around them. They never forgot the feeling of helplessness, of being sent forward like cattle to slaughter, of following orders they knew were wrong because to refuse was unthinkable. And the question haunts us still. Why did they obey? Why did they keep climbing out of those trenches when they could see what was happening? Why didn't they refuse? The answer is complicated. Part of it was military discipline, backed by the threat of execution. Part of it was social pressure, the fear of being labeled a coward. Part of it was genuine belief in the cause, in defending their country, in doing their duty. Part of it was simply not knowing any alternative. This was how war was fought. This was what soldiers did. You followed orders. You trusted your commanders. You believed the plan would work because the alternative, believing your leaders would send you to certain death for nothing, was too terrible to accept. But there's something deeper too. Something about human nature, about our capacity for obedience, even in the face of obvious danger, about how training and conditioning can override survival instinct, about how young men who should have run for their lives instead walked steadily forward because authority told them to. The generals who ordered the attack weren't monsters. They weren't trying to kill their own men. They genuinely believed the plan would work. They believed the bombardment would succeed. They believed discipline and courage would carry the day. They were wrong. Catastrophically, tragically wrong. But they believed. The problem was systemic. Military thinking hadn't caught up with military technology. The generals were fighting the last war, not this one. They couldn't admit that everything they knew about warfare was obsolete. That honor and courage and discipline meant nothing against barbed wire and machine guns and artillery. That sending men forward in lines was suicide. That the only way to take those trenches was with new tactics, new weapons, new thinking. Tanks, creeping barrages, infiltration tactics. All of these would come later, lessons written in blood. But on July 1 Est, 1916, those lessons hadn't been learned yet. So the men walked, and they died, and their names are carved on memorials across England and France. Village war memorials, with list after list of names. 20, 30, 40 men from a single town, all killed on the same day. Entire generations wiped out in a morning. There's a memorial in France, the Thiepval Memorial to the missing of the Somme. It towers over the battlefield. On its walls are carved the names of 72,000 men who have no known grave. Men who were blown apart by shells, or buried in collapsed trenches, or who simply vanished into the mud. 72,000 names. And that's just the ones who were never found. Walking through those fields today, you'd never know. The trenches have been filled in. The shell holes have grassed over. It's peaceful farmland now, quiet, beautiful. But dig down a few feet and you'll still find bullets, bones, rusted equipment. The earth remembers. The soldiers who walked into those machine guns deserve to be remembered too. Not as heroes, not as fools, but as human beings caught in a nightmare not of their making. Men who did what they thought was right, what they had been trained to do, what their society expected of them. Men who obeyed orders that should never have been given. Their sacrifice taught the world a lesson. That obedience without question can be as dangerous as cowardice. That authority isn't always right. That following orders isn't always the same as doing the right thing. That sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is refuse. But they didn't refuse. They climbed the ladders. They walked forward. They fell, and we remember them. We have to remember them. Because forgetting them, forgetting what happened on that day, means it could happen again. War has changed since 1916. Tactics have evolved. Technology has advanced, but human nature remains the same. Our capacity for obedience, our willingness to follow authority even unto death, our tendency to believe that this time will be different, that our leaders know best, that sacrifice will lead to victory. The men of July 1916 believed that too. They were wrong, and they paid for that mistake with their lives. 60,000 casualties, 20,000 dead in a single day, because they were ordered to walk into machine guns, and they obeyed. That's the legacy of the Somme. Not glory, not victory, just loss. Staggering, pointless, preventable loss. And a question that echoes through history: how do we prevent it from happening again? We remember. We question. We never forget the cost of blind obedience. We never forget the men who walked forward that summer morning. We never forget what happened when soldiers were ordered to do the impossible, and they obeyed. Because they deserve to be remembered, every single one of them.